Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining the Clallam County EDC Coffee Chat, Coffee with Colleen. We are honored to have our local state senator join us today, Senator Michael Chapman, and we expect Representative Adam Bernbaum to be able to join us. I know everyone has lots of questions for Senator Chapman, but before we kick it off, I'm going to ask that you put yourself on mute. And if I don't see you on mute, I'll go ahead and put you on mute so we don't inadvertently pick up background noise that would interrupt our discussion. And if you'd like to ask Senator Chapman any questions, I'm sure many of you would. Please either raise your hand and we'll go in order of folks who have raised their hand. Alternatively, if you'd prefer that I ask the question on your behalf, then go ahead and just put that in the chat to everyone, and I'll read it to Senator Chapman. So with that, I think it's 8:02 and we usually try to kick it off by this point. So Senator Chapman, I see Representative Tharinger is joining us. So that's wonderful. So again, thank you for joining us and please take it away.
Well, thanks everyone for being here. I do want to get to your questions. So I think obviously what we've been doing in Olympia has been pretty well reported. Probably no surprises. Yesterday, the revenue package rolled out. It's a significant revenue package that would allow the budget to be balanced without using the rainy day fund. So I think that's a positive and should be enough of a revenue package to have us finish up our work a week from Sunday. So I think those are two things that I heard the most about. Certainly folks don't want to, then the state treasurer, I think Mike Pelliciotti, did a pretty compelling argument why we wouldn't want to use our rainy day fund right now. It would have potentially lowered our bond rating. And that's just not something that we should have been interested in. Also, I think we don't know what the federal government, the cuts, are coming. There have been cuts, and potentially more cuts. So I think keeping a robust rainy day fund was something that I support. The revenue package will be up for debate starting today in the Senate Ways and Means Committee. It's a robust revenue package that kind of would hit every, the way I look at it, it looks like there's going to be pain, if you believe that taxes are painful. There'll be increased taxes probably for just about everybody in the state of Washington. There's a pretty good article yesterday in the Seattle Times. I hope everybody gets a chance to read it. The influence of Microsoft on the revenue package, and maybe influenced in a way that I'm not totally convinced was helpful. So there's that element as well, but fairly across the board, including, property tax increase limits being raised from 1% to 3%, a significant senior citizen exemption on property tax or relief, which is always a little tricky in an area like Clallam County because we have so many seniors, so they'll get property tax relief. But for your local governments, they're still going to collect as much money, so that money that the seniors won't be paying will be again pushed on to the average family. And so this will be a double hit on property tax, I think, to a certain degree. There's a higher threshold. The capital gains tax will be tiered so that at certain levels that the capital gains tax would bump up to 10%. Yesterday, the Senate passed a bill that the House had already passed on the Climate Commitment Act, which is some debate, but it's inevitable that will raise the auction prices, which will lead to probably a little bit higher fuel pump. And then our revenue for transportation is looking at anywhere from a 6 to 9% gas tax increase, and also increases on EV registration fees. There's an across the board B&O tax increase, and then a second increase to hit our largest companies like Microsoft, Amazon, those folks. There's some significant current tax breaks that are rolled back. One is would hurt like our community banks like First Federal. they've been getting a significant tax break on carried interest for their mortgage lending. That tax break is rolled back. That's gonna, from what they're telling, the community bankers are telling me, that will significantly curtail their ability to maybe lend. And some other significant tax breaks that have been on the books for a while, that through a JLARC study, it was determined that they were of no value. So I think that's up for interpretation. People will make the case that some of those tax breaks are of value. I know I probably missed one or two other pieces to the revenue package. All of it is $14 billion over 4 years to balance a budget. And, we don't know, the governor only took the wealth tax off the table. I think we'll still pass in the Senate, at least. We're going to consider a wealth tax, probably with a referendum clause. So we would adopt it and then it would go straight to the voters. That might bypass a governor veto. And we'll see what the voters, I would assume that tax would pass quite easily in Washington state. But then we don't really know, at least on the Senate side, I haven't heard of kind of what the governor would be thinking on all these other taxes in order to balance the budget, in order not to use the rainy day fund, in order to fulfill our union contract and the other funding needs. And then there's some targeted cuts along the way as well. So that's kind of that's just the operating and transportation, trying to, again, the Senate has a 6%, a 6-cent gas tax increase. The House has, I think, a 9. We're trying to meld that together, but we're trying to keep projects like the Swim to Blinn corridor project. If we don't have a new revenue package, that project will be delayed significantly, if not canceled. We're trying to comply with all the court-ordered culvert replacements in transportation, and that's a huge dollar, and there's some negotiations going on around that. And then I'll let Steve talk about the capital budget, but that's probably the one budget that's, A, it didn't have to raise revenue, and B, it's the construction budget. So and I think the 24th would be well served by the 2 proposals in the Senate and the House on the capital side. So I'll shut up, and I'll throw it over to Representative Tharinger or Bernbaum.
Great, they're both on. So thanks for that opening. And if either of our representatives would like to take it, please do.
Well, good morning. I don't hear Adam. Hi to everybody. I know so was I think Mike did a good job of summarizing what's going on. It's going to be a busy, 8-9 days here as we wrap all this up. To today, all the policy bills have to be out of the respective chambers, and then we focus on budget bills, revenue bills, and finalizing the budgets. I think I know. So notice in the chat there was I think Jim Harvard had some questions about cuts. It's about I think there's about 6 to 7 billion in cuts. So I think if you look across there's kind of 3 pathways here. One is the revenue that Mike talked about. One is cuts, for a lot of services across the state, and then there's some budget moves. The main one is with Left One, which is a pension fund, which is very, very robust, has about $5 billion in it. And those monies, I think there's 4 or 5 active members in Left One. And then I don't know what the number of retirees is, but it's not a large number. So you could leave, $500 million in there and meet those obligations, and then move that money to, to meet some other needs and other pensions and general fund obligations. The 2 chambers have different approaches on that, and that'll have to be resolved in the next, the next few days. But so there's a couple of moves like that's moving money around to make, everything balance. And on the capital budget, as Mike said, we're be honest, I think we're a little behind in our negotiations, but that'll hopefully crank up, the next couple of days. And if everything goes right, we should be done by the 27th. But there's a lot to do between now and then, that's for sure.
Thank you. Representative Bernbaum?
Yeah, thank you all for having me on this morning. I'm here in Olympia, and my roommate's phone was going off as you asked that question. I was looking around trying to find it, so ready and attentive. I'll just speak really briefly about the transportation budget. Of the three, that is one that I've been paying the most attention to. I think one of the and I also think that substantively it's the place where the House and the Senate budgets started farthest apart. Um, and the real question there is how much do we borrow? So the Senate transportation budget had about $7 billion in bonds and was sort of premised on the idea that another $5 billion in borrowing would be created to address the culverts. And as Mike said, it is a real challenge to get a lot of local projects funded this year without having significant new borrowing. And so it's sort of two philosophically different questions. How much of a revenue package, how much of a transportation package are we doing this year? Um, I will say just in response to some questions, I see two questions, one about cuts, one about how do we engage the transportation committee. Um, both transportation budgets assume fairly significant cuts and significant delays with or without new bonding. So there is genuinely quite a bit of pain in those budgets that is a function of the shortfall in our transportation revenue resources. The shift from gas to electric vehicles has led to a structural reduction in the revenue that we have to maintain our roads without reducing the number of vehicles that are driving on those roads. And so until we fix that problem, um, it's going to be hard for us to come up with sustainable budgets for transportation. And that's, maybe we'll get a bit closer to that this year. I don't think we're going to fully fix that problem because it means either implementing something like the RUC or significantly increasing the registration and renewal fees for electric vehicles. Those are both very politically challenging things to do. And I don't think that we have done the work to socialize those ideas enough to get voter buy-in yet. We have to do one of them. So we've got to we've got to find something that people are comfortable with. Um, in terms of engaging the transportation committee to identify cost-saving measures, you can email me or call me whenever you'd like. And Mike is also on the transportation committee in the Senate. That I'd love to have that as an interim conversation. So anytime you want to chat about the policy ideas, please reach out.
Yeah, Mel Gildow owns Coal Scrubbers, and so his technology drastically improves the fuel consumption of vessels, and he's been having a lot of trouble getting the ferry system to look at a locally owned, veteran-owned business. But I'm sure that's what that's about. So I'll be sure, Mel, to give you Representative Bernbaum's contact information. So I'm going to go to Robert, who's got his hand raised. Robert?
Hi, my name is Robert. I'm in Port Angeles, Washington, and thank you for the time here and everything. So I guess one concern I wanted to bring up that I was curious what our senator and representatives had to say about is the deportations that are happening in Washington through Northwest Detention Center, through our airstrips with different chartered flights, sending people, both, people who haven't committed any crimes and people who have committed crimes who don't deserve to go to these concentration camps in El Salvador. And granted, there's the whole separation of powers and the Constitution and stuff, but that's not really being used right now by the current administration. So what are ways that y'all can make things as difficult as possible, if not impossible, for them to commit these atrocities in Washington? Thanks.
Who wants to take that?
Well, I'll take that. So there's a fairly strong, even I think both caucuses, a fairly strong Latino, caucus, members of color caucus, and they're monitoring this pretty closely and providing services to protect folks as much as possible. What's interesting is, and I don't know, I see Susie's on the call. The greatest resource, more than oil, more than agricultural projects. It's like $55 billion is our international student involvement in our colleges and community colleges. And Trump is destroying that through these policies. It is a huge resource, both human resource and financial resource for, and speaks to the quality of our institutions, our higher education institutions. And by him just randomly, I think Shoreline, for example, community college, just for people who had student visas were picked up. And you don't know what happens to them, whether they end up in El Salvador or they end in a detention facility in Tacoma, and they're all privately run. So Trump has made arrangements with these private companies to set up these detention centers, but it is impacting a huge segment of our economy, a huge, if you're into balance of payments, which I think is, kind of a silly metric, quite frankly, this has the largest amount of balance of payments of international money coming into the country, and he's destroying it with these. And then I think it's Steve Miller who's doing most of this, Stephen Miller. So it's very destructive, and there are some efforts that are being done at the, through the legislature by outreach to various organizations, but it's a huge challenge. And it's not very smart, really, quite frankly. It's shooting yourself in the foot if you're looking at balance, if you're all involved with balance of payments, because this is huge international dollars coming into the country because of our universities and community colleges.
I'll just briefly chip in. It's a profoundly stupid policy. It's a profoundly cruel policy. But to get to the heart of what I've lost the person who asked the question here. But to get to the heart of the question, at the state level yet, I don't know what policy tools we have to meaningfully to provide legal and meaningful barriers to that type of federal activity. I know that there are discussions. I haven't seen them yet. I know that's probably not the answer that folks on this call want to hear, but that's the truth.
All right, thank you. Dr. Ames.
Good morning. Sorry, I'm not on camera this morning. One comment and one question to follow up on Representative Tharinger's just comment about the international students. Thank you for your awareness and recognition. That has not hit Peninsula College, but it has hit 4 or 5 of our sister colleges, community colleges in Washington, and several universities. And I think to Representative Bernbaum's point, we really are powerless from that perspective because visas are granted at the federal level. In order for them to come to college, but we don't have any granting authority. And this action is particularly disturbing because the colleges are actually never told. We have a database, a federal database that we access, and we are now scouring that database twice daily to see if any of our students' names show up on it. So it's just really diabolical, the approach that they're taking as well. My question, I want to follow up on Jim Hagewood's question about reductions that are coming. And I just want to raise awareness that the community colleges are bracing for some pretty frightening cuts that will directly mean layoffs to Peninsula College employees. And I know that our legislators have been working super hard to find a way, but I just think everyone should know that there's some really painful cuts coming. So wanted to just see if there's kind of what the members' thoughts are on where the community colleges might fare at the end of the day. Thank you.
Well, I think from my perspective, you have a House budget and a Senate budget, and if whatever's not funded in those 2 budgets is not likely to be funded, that's probably just the reality right now. So specifically, St. Susie, I don't know where you got cut in those budgets, but if you're in one, you have a better chance, but we're probably not to the point of adding anything back, especially not, we won't know until, so the Senate will pass its revenue package on Saturday, then that gives the budget folks 1 week to kind of finalize their budget. It's assumed that every tax increase that was put on the table yesterday will pass the Senate, but one never knows for sure. It's likely they will all pass, so that definitely would be better news, but I'm not sure. You'll have to specifically kind of point to where you're being cut, I think, because I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, well, some of the ideas that are currently in the House or Senate budget are not fully funding COLAs, furlough days, which means the college will be closed, cutting our cybersecurity program, cutting our commercial truck driving licensing program, and others. So that's what we're facing.
Yeah, I would just add, Susie, and we've been chatting off and on. In the budget, our budget world, K-12 is, a constitutional duty. Higher ed is not. And so in operating budgets and quite frankly, in capital budgets, they tend to take hits when we have, budget challenges. And so I think that that's what you're going to see. I think that, I don't know if these revenue packages pass, as Mike says, that they probably will, whether there's any extra dollars in those packages to help be strategic about putting
less revenue than was in our budget.
so that there'd be some chance to, maybe backfill some of these things. But I think it's going to be a challenge because I think the budgets were built on more revenue. Both the House and Senate budget were built on more revenue than these packages actually generate.
The final thing that I would chip in is the real bottleneck is over the next couple of years in terms of these budgets. So there is a tension between the size of the revenue number that'll get tossed around and when some or all of that revenue could come online. So I'll give as an example that if we did some version of the intangibles tax or some of these newer revenue proposals, there's a lag period between their implementation and us passing them. And one of the consequences of that is that this year we're going to vote on a bunch of revenue and there are going to be significant cuts. In future out biennium, I think that pain is going to diminish, but it's very, I mean, for the reasons that Steve articulated, it's very challenging right now, in particular for, and I know you and I have been talking about this too, Susie, to get anything back in particular for these larger sort of buckets of money like the community colleges.
Okay, thank you. Paul Gottlieb asked the question for each of you. What is your position on efforts to cap rental increases? And please highlight one piece of legislation that you favored and one piece of legislation you have opposed and why. So it's kind of a three-part question for each of you. So 9 responses.
Yeah, I'll keep the mic. Yeah, so it's a good 3-parter, Paul. So
Typical reporter.
I voted for the rent stabilization bill, and I did it with a little bit of heartburn this year. And my reasoning for voting for it is basically as follows. I think that the market more or less assumed that we were going to pass rent stabilization. And I think you can see that in the way that lot fees increased in manufactured home parks across the North Peninsula. And it felt to me that we were living in the worst of both worlds, where in Sequim, for example, you saw there was one set of 4 parks where there's a 250% 5-year increase in the lot fees that people are experiencing there. So you have manufactured home park owners who are baking in price increases because every year they think, oh, this is the year that I'm not going to be able to increase my prices by whatever amount anymore. But the people who live in those parks didn't actually enjoy any of the protections. So it seemed it in particular around the manufactured home parks, which is the group for whom I find myself thinking about most when considering this policy, it felt very urgent that we took some action Um, and so I ultimately voted for the bill. I think that I have some concern that it might deter investment. You know, the market might be less likely to put dollars into building more supply. But again, the question I ask myself is a politically sophisticated investor who's considering putting that money into Washington state, looking at the state legislature and not concerned that we wouldn't pass this policy anyway. I had a hard time saying no in answer to that question. And so as a result, I ultimately decided to vote for it. I'll be briefer on the next two parts of the question. Piece of legislation I support, a piece I oppose. So a piece of legislation that I support that didn't ultimately pass this year is the rural ADU bill, though it got a lot farther and it got some buy-in from a crucial stakeholder that had been impeding it. FutureWise came in pro on a bill from a Republican state representative that would make it easier for rural counties in their GMA planning to have to allow detached ADUs. I think that is a very important supply bill for our community, and it's one that I'm looking forward to trying to help get across the finish line next year. And a piece of legislation that I oppose and why. So I was I'm pausing because there's a lot of bad legislation. It's hard to think of just one piece. Honestly, uh, so there was a piece of policy around significantly increasing criminal penalties at the individual level for individual workers for environmental crimes, so for violations of of three environmental acts. I'm picking one where I was kind of at odds with the rest of the Democratic caucus, because it might be more interesting to the members of this call. That I had a lot of concern about in terms of potentially deterring, having a chilling effect on folks wanting to work in the trades or in other industrial settings. I think that one maybe we can return to for real violators, but wasn't ready for prime time this year.
Great, thank you. Senator Chapman?
Okay, so yeah, I did vote for the rent stabilization bill in the Senate. It was amended. I voted against the amendments. It was amended in a way that is going to make it a little tricky maybe in negotiations with the House. So that bill is not a guarantee. I think stabilizing rents has just become a core value of the Democratic Party, and just people are really concerned with rising housing costs. So it's just that was a fairly easy vote. Something I did oppose in the past, but I listened to a lot of folks when I was campaigning last year, and became convinced that a majority of the district definitely supported that policy. So glad to see that pass. A bill I opposed, I actually I think my two seatmates also opposed it, was the unemployment for striking workers bill. In the Senate, would have been 12 weeks of unemployment for people who strike or take time off to organize, those sorts of things. So even like a small sandwich shop, folks could walk out and within 2 weeks start getting unemployment. The fiscal note on that was just going to kind of really blow up our unemployment system. It has been shortened to 4 weeks in the House. The Senate now will consider the 4 week. I still think I'm opposed. And one of the main reasons why I'm opposed is you look at Swains. Swains are union workers. I don't know if folks know that. They're UFCW 21 represented. They always have had a contract, and one of the general managers of Swains has talked to me about this bill and indicated that, number one, they've always had labor peace. They've always had contracts. They've never had to go out on strike. And number two, they have a perfect record with the unemployment insurance. They don't, Swains just doesn't lay people off. Let's be honest. If you don't work there for 10 years or more, you're a newbie. So he was worried about all of retail potentially going through a bunch of strikes and unemployment insurance and, you know, be across, he was worried about, they were worried about their rate. And I had to respect the fact that number one, they're union shop, and number two, they've had maintained labor peace. So I think that's one of the reasons why I've opposed that bill. A bill I support, I think there's, you know, there's been a lot of good pieces of legislation. There's not just one bill I think that I've really enjoyed. But you know, I think at the end of the day, the most important bill that will pass for our district will be the capital budget. It's been an honor to work on that. And I think that when folks see the investments in the 24th legislative district that'll be coming down, that'll be a real potential change. It's a real positive, and it's going to create a lot of jobs and a lot of opportunities in our district that we wouldn't have otherwise. So I'm glad that the capital budget passed off the Senate floor unanimously, and expect that the final budget will pass unanimously. And it's a solidly bipartisan budget and has to be bipartisan. And I think Representative Tharinger has set the tone for over the years as chair in the House on the importance of the capital budget to our district. And, you know, just kind of glad to be part of the ride on the Senate side. I'm not the chair, but have had an opportunity to have some influence there. So I think that'll be one that we'll all spend a lot more time talking about once that's passed.
Great, thank you. Representative Tharinger?
Well, I can save us some time. I'm pretty much aligned with Mike on this. You know, I think the rent stabilization makes a huge difference. And as Adam said, particularly for people in mobile home parks where there's been this, you know, excessive rate increases that are really, I don't even think they're driven by market forces. They're just driven by people exploiting other folks. And I was not a fan of the unemployment you know, the UI bill for striking workers. I think that just really threw an imbalance to that whole process. And so I was not in favor of that. And I think Mike's also right. For us in the 24th, the capital budget's pretty important. We've been able to make some pretty strategic investments that I think this time will be no different. So that's kind of where, you know, I spend a lot of my time, obviously, is working on that.
Perfect, thank you. So John Temple asked Senator Chapman, what are your thoughts on wealth taxes, please?
Yeah, I mean, I will vote for the bill that comes forward on the wealth tax, whether it has a referendum clause or not. I thought the governor maybe didn't need to put a veto on the table quite so fast. Let's, you know, I think it could be passed, and then it could be implemented, and then it could be litigated in court. And I think that's kind of the process. But looks like in the Senate we'll have a wealth tax to vote on, and then which would include a referendum clause, which means it would just go directly to the voters. That's something that I'll support.
Perfect. John Ralston writes, I want to commend Senator Chapman on his current position regarding public records regarding privilege, and wants to know what Representative Tharinger and Bernbaum's position are on that issue.
Hey, let me just clarify something on that. The only reason, and I'm not trying to look, many of my colleagues disagree with my position. I'm in the deep minority of people, but here is my position. People do email in sensitive information, and it's really difficult to not release that. So I just want the public that I serve to know, if you email my office, it is going to be a public record, because I don't have the staff or the time to call and redact out of the thousands of emails. So if you email, you know, if you contact my office, say, I want to see every email that came in under this name or under this issue, my staff is just going to release it, because we just don't. So I want people to know, please don't email me sensitive information. It's going to be a public record. And I thought this was the best way to do that. But I totally respect other legislators who have differences. I am in the deep minority on this issue. And I think it gets conflated sometimes as somehow other people are trying to hide things. I don't think that's the case. I just know for my staff, that was the easiest decision to make. It's just, if you want an email my office and we will release it. But I do want the public to know, don't put sensitive information you don't want released into an email into my office. It's a public record. But I just don't have the time to do the redaction on the thousands and thousands and thousands of emails we get every legislative session. So nothing more, not trying to make a political statement. It was simply something I talked with my staff, and they agreed with the decision that we'll just release the record, but now the public should know that. So definitely respect Steve and Adam in their position. So let's not make this a I'm right and they're wrong kind of moment. I don't know that there is a right or wrong. It's just part of the whole process of public records and how each office is an individual office to a degree. And so we all have to make our decisions. So my decision was made with my staff, and it's just more out of respect to the public. Please don't send me your social security number or sensitive information about your medical records. If you need that kind of help, call the office and we will help you. So.
And if I could
Thank
just
you.
put a bit of flavor on that from since I work the staff side of this, there's a big component of what our offices do, which is casework and constituent services. And so people will be corresponding with us or with our staffers on a daily basis about pretty personal stuff that's going on in their lives that they're asking for help with. And I'll also add that there are some people who are a little unwell that will send reams and reams and reams of personal medical information, endless documentation containing information that a reasonable person would not want exposed to the public. And it's up to legislators to make determinations about whether or not you share that. So I think there's I'm really repeating Mike's point, but I I can't imagine ever looking at a piece of correspondence and saying, "Oh, I don't want someone to know that whatever I shared with another member in email." That really is not the lens that I have on when I'm thinking about this issue. It's to preserve trying to preserve the privacy of people who are working through some challenging stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
Thank
I've
you.
never invoked, privilege, legislative privilege. We've got offices totally transparent. If there's issues, we have attorneys, we'll check with the attorney. But my policy is to, be totally open and share. There's, as Adam and both Mike said, there are issues that are sort of challenging. I will just say, folks kind of wonder why we have budget challenges at the state. This is a whole new cost for governments, and folks that are in local government realize this very much. But public information requests and this demand is, I mean, it's an important, I think, function to have open government, but there's exceptional costs to doing this. We're creating whole new office buildings to be able to, at the state level, to be able to house these people, and the salaries, we have to pay the salaries because it is overwhelming the number of requests. And so it's just one of those added costs that wasn't very acute 10 years ago and is now a huge cost for us. And I see Matt sort of shaking his, nodding his head. I mean, anyone who's in government realizes this. And so, this is just one of the challenges. But for my office, I think in the 15 years, I've never, evoked legislative privilege. There's a couple of times where I've run up by the attorneys, and the attorneys have said, well, it's totally your choice, and there's other legislators involved. I mean, it gets complex pretty quickly, but never use that protection. So.
All right, thank you. Jim McIntyre asks, as far as the outlook for next year's supplemental and the next biennium, has the legislature set itself up for no repeat of this year's budget hole?
I think that it's the intent absolutely that is absolutely the intent. I don't think I could say with any clarity that I know what is going to happen at a federal level or at a global level with the economy. And so it makes it very challenging to speculate about what types of revenues we'll be looking at or what types of costs we might be facing depending on the amount of federal backfill depending on if we tilt toward a recession and the sales tax revenues go down significantly. So too many variables on the fundamental stuff to speak to it, but we pass the goal is to pass a balanced budget. And there's a lot of and with some political pain. These are not that conversation with Susie Ames. I don't think um, it does not feel good to say, hey, we weren't able to get everything that we wanted in the budget for the college. That's not something any of us want to come out of these negotiations saying. So, and that conversation is being repeated by state legislators across the state. Um, the cuts that we're facing right now are very real. The pushback on each piece of revenue is very real. Uh, it is not something that's being done out of artifice, because people want to. There's a long way of saying that there's a very sincere attempt at passing a long-term balanced budget. Um, I'm taking a long time saying this because I also think it's fair, depending on what happens, we might be having some version of this conversation again in a couple of years. And that won't have anything to do with what's going on right now in the state legislature.
Thank you.
I'll add, I guess I disagree a little bit. I think this is the first of many years of tax increases. We have basically doubled the budget over the last 10 years, and yet basic education still isn't fully funded. People still don't have health care. Colleges still aren't fully funded. Early learning isn't fully funded. Childcare is still not fully funded. So the needs and the demands on the state continue to grow. It's my expectation and prediction that the state budget could very well see a doubling over the next decade. We haven't even built in a single base. We really haven't even taken into account any federal budget cuts, which we know will hit. Although there's an article in the Seattle Times about Head Start being cut in Central Washington. If Head Start was cut around the whole state, that would throw an enormous amount of working families into turmoil and trouble. And I think the state would have to raise taxes and pick up that loss of revenue from the federal government. They have not finished looking at Medicaid and Medicare. And I think that those cuts are coming. And I think our hospitals can't take those cuts. So would we just sit back and say, we're not going to raise taxes and raise revenue and let our hospitals go under? So if people think that this is the only round of tax increases, that's just not going to happen. And this is a state that has continued to meet the need and the demands to the best of our ability. And people live here and people want to move here, and people accept the fact that you're going to pay higher revenue to have a healthy hospital, to have healthy schools, to build new schools. And the public has shown over and over again through the election last year with the new school bonds and keeping the capital gains tax and keeping the Climate Commitment Act, that they're more than willing to pay for new revenue to continue to have the services. But we are a long way from saying, oh, we fixed the problem, everybody's funded, and we can sit back and relax. We are always going to be having more needs that need to be funded than we have revenue, and we will continue to look for new ways to find revenue to meet the demands, because just come and work with me for a day early in session and listen to all the meetings, all the people like Susie who come down to Olympia and say, we're not meeting the demand on our services, the educators who come down, the hospitals that I meet with every week, every hospital in the district, Forks, less than 2 weeks cash on hand, Olympic Medical Center, Jefferson Healthcare. So if you want to just say we're done, then we're done at a status quo right now that is underfunded in virtually every level of the 24th legislative district. So I guess my answer is no, this isn't the end. Yes, you can expect new taxes this year and new taxes in the future and higher revenue spending, higher spending, and hopefully a growing economy that also brings in more revenue so we can continue to have the kind of state that we love and that people want to live in. Washington is still a destination place. Case in point, a 1,000 square foot home in my neighborhood over by the Catholic Church in Port Angeles. I'm walking by on Saturday morning and they're putting up a real estate sign. My wife and I go home, we look it up. $395,000 for a 1,000 square foot home on half a lot by the Catholic Church. We take an evening walk on Saturday because it was a nice day. Sold sign. that tells me that people want to live in Port Angeles and in Clallam County and on the North Olympic Peninsula. That means somebody who, if, you know, that means more demand on our services. So that's a long way to say, we're not done. This is just the beginning. And I think, and it takes into no account federal cuts. And we're certainly, the state certainly wouldn't sit back and try and not to do anything as the federal cuts come. So that's my take on this. This is the beginning of many years of this.
Okay, thank you. Steve asked, did a carve out for an exemption for a minimum exempt salary for nonprofits make any progress this session?
Yeah, I'm not so sure I'm aware of that policy or that bill. So I'd say no.
Okay,
I don't remember it coming through appropriations anyway, so.
okay. Jim Hagwood asked, what legislation has been passed to improve economic development in the state and especially in rural Washington? I think I know the answer to that, and it's none. It's gone
Yeah,
the
I
other
think
way.
that's, I think that's right. In fact, as Colleen is, you know, he wrote us a letter, the EDOs are getting cut, the economic development groups are getting cut, you know, not an important function, and you guys do a great job, but, you know, that's not, the type of thing that, you know, is a core function of the state. It's important, but those are the types of things that are being cut. And back to, I think, the question around surplus, we're building in some surplus into the capital budget. Like, for example, I think the revenue that might be generated that adds to our bond capacity from these bills that will pass in the next week. I think both the Senate and the House agreed to just put that in our bottom line for the supplemental next year. But to both Mike and Adam's point, the variables that are coming out of the federal government are, you know, they just make uncertainty, you know, they add about a factor of about 20, as the actuarials look at it, about a 25% increase to uncertainty. And anyone who tries to budget or run a business knows that uncertainty is a huge problem. So, and there's no, in my view, sanity in sight to kind of stabilize things. So I think it's going to be a huge challenge for us. And I think it was mentioned, Medicaid was mentioned. We've been pretty aggressive as a state in getting waivers from CMS to expand our programs. So we have about a $14 billion exposure in Medicaid. So if they say they cut that in half and make it a block grant, we would immediately have about an $8 to $9 billion hole in providing, as to Mike's point, to providing services, reimbursement rates for our hospitals and healthcare providers, nursing homes, all the things that Medicaid pays for. And so there is a lot of, you know, unpredictability and chaos on the horizon unless somebody gets a little more mature and sophisticated in DC.
Great, thank you. James, you had a question?
So, thank you very much for presenting here, first of all. We just talked about the house down by the Catholic Church being sold in a day. And I think that really represents that we have a housing crisis. Yet we have excessive regulation above and beyond federal regulation that really is inhibiting our ability to build more houses. So can you address that?
You know, we have passed a number of pieces of legislation. We just passed one yesterday, directly basically forcing local governments to reduce regulation around the housing supply and where housing can be built. And so I think that there's going to be a number of cities and counties that are going to actually have to back off where they allow housing. It's going to be required in certain places, and the lot splitting issue is now, you know, working through its process to be in state law. Transit-oriented development that's going to require cities to make transit-oriented development. They're going to have to include that in their comp plan. So I expect that, you know, we have to build 1 million new homes in the next 20 years. And I think that you're going to see a lot of that begin to come online. For the North Olympic Peninsula, it does, you know, I don't know exactly how many more people we can absorb without kind of permanent gridlock between Hood Canal Bridge and the peninsula, but I think the city of Port Angeles has taken on some innovative approaches, but I do think you're going to see really significant building projects take off in this state. And supply, what they tell me is that more supply will drive down costs. I'm skeptical that more supply will drive down costs significantly, because I think the demand for people wanting to live in Washington is just going to continue, and that we're now a climate refugee place. Look, in August, where in the world do you want to be than the North Olympic Peninsula? People want to live here, and people in my neighborhood are moving from Phoenix and Colorado and Texas and places in California. So it appears that the demand for people wanting to live on the peninsula is going to continue. So, but we have taken on a number of policies. So while we're working on rent stabilization to stabilize people's rents, we're also significantly increasing the ability for supply. And we're limited in the number of builders too. I mean, that's the one thing. You talk to the builders folks, and we need more builders. We need more young people entering that trade. And I think the future of building in Washington State is going to be one of the great economic drivers, along with our investment infrastructure. Someone talked about maybe we didn't do enough on specific legislation for the rural economy, although I'm working on a port grant program so that ports can continue to access dollars for infrastructure. But you look at the transportation package, you look at I would argue that replacing our fish barriers has been a huge economic driver, and that there's more construction work occurring on the peninsula, on our roadways, on our bridges, on our fish passages than maybe ever in the time that I've been in office. So, rural economic development's occurring through the investment of public dollars with the private sector putting people to work. And I see a lot of trucks. I get behind a lot of trucks. I also see more log trucks on the road. And I think that the log supply is going to continue to grow. And then with the Trump administration opening up the Forest Service, that could be a real boom for new log supply that comes in from a place that the Forest Service has been kind of mismanaged over the years. So probably better to thin it and bring those logs in than before it burns. So I think the future is bright. If it wasn't bright, people wouldn't want to live on the peninsula. I guess that's my argument, that we are not putting up a sign saying, will the last person leave the Olympic Peninsula, please close the door behind you. We are a place that is very desirable. And I think we forget that sometimes. I think we forget what a wonderful place we have to live and all the good things. And I go to Swain's on a Saturday. That store is incredibly busy. This is not an area that's challenged with retail sales. We have our challenges. I'm not saying that, but we do have to be a little positives too. This is still an area where people want to be here. And I think that's exciting.
Thank you, Senator Chapman. Paul Gottlieb asks, what's your position on increasing the 1% cap on property tax increases?
I'll just say, it's a bill that I'll be supporting.
Okay, thank you.
I am not going to support a property tax increase this year. And this is another tough one for me, because I know that at the local level, the municipalities and the counties really do need that revenue to balance their budgets. The 1% cap has significantly constricted them. I spent, and if you had asked me at the beginning of my campaign for office if I would have supported that policy, I think I said this on the trail a few times. I think I said that I probably would. And I talked to a lot of senior citizens who are on fixed incomes, and the average, it's going from a 1% to a 3% increase. The median property tax pass a payer in Washington pays about would pay about $40, $4,200 average property tax payment. So you pay $40 more at the 1% level. You'd pay $80 more a year after that. And I hit a point talking to people who are balancing budgets where they got $1,300, $1,400 a month, where in particular people who, senior citizens, I'm just going to go back to talking about manufactured home parks here. Senior citizens who live in manufactured home parks or apartment complexes where those costs are getting passed through to them. They don't benefit from the low-income senior property tax exemption, right? Because the owner of the larger facility is the one paying the property tax and passing it through in increases. I feel like I heard from a lot of people for whom that cost would be very challenging to absorb. And so that is a line that I've pushed back on. And I'm saying this here in part because I think that there are some perhaps constitutionally questionable or legally questionable policies that would make that property tax much better. For example, a homestead exemption or an exemption on the first $200,000 of homes. If we were to implement either of those policies, I would be more than happy to support it. As Senator Chapman said, the likely solution that the legislature will have to the wealth tax will be to pass it with a referendum clause and give it to the voters with the expectation it will get challenged in court. I am a skeptic of the wealth taxes policy. I don't know how much that will ever collect. I get we should make the rich pay their fair share. And I will probably end up supporting that policy in part to give it its day in court. I would like to see us do the same thing with these property tax policies that would make that part of our tax code a lot more progressive. So that's my thinking about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be supporting the package as it comes, through the House. Part of it is, the state increase and then the additional capacity at a local councilmatic level, right? So the city councils and the commissioners, they get to make that choice. That seems to me to be, a good way to proceed. And as we've talked about some added costs that governments are absorbing, and that cap has just been, I think, a challenge. I'm not a big fan of either property tax or sales tax, but I know that in Clallam County, I have a bill that didn't get out of Finance Committee that would give councilmatic authority to counties and cities to raise 0.1% sales tax for early learning and childcare and children's services, with the idea of getting upstream. That would raise, I think for Clallam County, that raises like $1.2 million, 1.6 million, where the property tax increase raises about 350,000. So, and in a tourist-based economy like the peninsula, I think the sales tax makes some sense. But I'll live to fight that battle another day, I think, for next year. But for the reasons I think both Mike and Adam made have good points around the property tax, but it's part of the package, and we're not going to get out of town if we don't get it off the floor.
Hey, I gotta jump on another Zoom call, you guys. Thanks everyone for your engagement, and appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone today. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Chapman. Yeah, it's just about 9 o'clock, so we appreciate you all joining us, and I'm sure we'll have our representatives on again after the session is over. Thanks for all you do.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you, Colleen.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Good questions.